Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission Podcast. My name is Rebecca Toomey, and we are on a mission to encourage and inspire you as you're navigating through your life and with your relationship with Christ. We are currently in a series called God's Design for Birth, and today we have a very special guest. She is an expert on birth. Her name is Diana Forcell-Tyen, and she is a writer, speaker, and she is the host of the Healing Birth podcast, which is now in its fifth season. So amazing. Her podcast is popular in 36 countries, which is amazing, including the US, Canada, Australia, the UK. She's the co-founder of Healing Birth, which is a perinatal support organization that's dedicated to supporting women in various ways who've experienced birth trauma. Diana is trained with birthing from within as a birth story listener and offers one-on-one non-clinical support to mothers who seek her help in processing their birth experiences. Diana's passion and commitment for this work comes from her own personal experience with a traumatic birth, its aftermath, and ultimately her healing. She's a mother of two sons and lives with her family on, I'm going to let you say where you live so I don't mispronounce it.
Kauai, Hawaii. We're the northernmost island in the Hawaiian chains.
Beautiful. And you can find more of Diana's work at healingbirth.net. You can listen to her podcast, Healing Birth, on all streaming platforms. Diana, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, you were a guest on my podcast, and that was one of my actually most favorite episodes. So it's really fun to see your face and get to talk again.
This is awesome. Yeah, something that I really want to share with listeners is the amazing impact that you've made on my life. And I don't even know if you realize it. I tell you, but I don't know if you really understand it. Without you, this podcast wouldn't even exist. It was in July of 2022, after I'd had my own traumatic birth, that I shared the story of Ben's birth with you on your show. And after we stopped recording, you were just so encouraging to me. And you just said something about you enjoyed my storytelling. I should do something with that. And I just couldn't stop thinking about it after that. I went to bed. I was thinking about what you said. And I really started praying for some guidance about sharing that story. Was there more to share? And from that came this podcast. The rest is history, but it all started with you and your words of encouragement. So thank you for encouraging me.
I'm so proud of you. I'm so glad you're doing this.
It's amazing. It was like we had such a great conversation, and it's been cool to see it spawn into more things. So you're changing women's lives literally with your podcast when it comes to birth and healing from birth trauma, but then you also changed mine.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. That's so kind. But I mean, you did it and you listened to the call. So, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess there's a little part there. I'm just so excited and honored really to have you here after knowing the history and how important it's been for me. It's just such an honor and a pleasure to have you and to learn from you, because that's really what this is all about. We love to share learning moments here on the show and takeaways, and we want to just help women to get to the answers faster. I think you could probably agree with a lot of that. We a lot of times go into birth without knowing much, or even going into the next birth, continuous births, and maybe we haven't learned in between, whatever it might be. It's such an amazing thing to get to learn from women who've walked through fire. And not only have you walked through fire, but you have listened to the fires of many other women. And that's what I want us to learn from you today, is all of the stuff that you have heard over all of these years, 5 seasons of listening to birth stories, traumatic birth stories, and stories of healing. So we're going to be peeling that onion back today to learn from you. And then next week, we'll focus on the birth trauma side. So if you are listening in and you have experienced birth trauma of your own, be sure to stay tuned for next week, because we're going to really dive into that specifically. But today we want to talk about learning moments. And I just want to hear from you first. How did it all start? How did it all progress? Tell us more about the Healing Birth podcast.
Yeah, I love to tell how this started because it's so magical. So when I was pregnant with my first baby, like a lot of people do, I think that it was around 10 years ago, and I think around 10 years ago is when podcasts kind of were becoming a thing, like
Mhm,
right around then.
mhm,
Like a lot of moms, I was listening to birth podcasts and I was
mm,
listening to birth stories, and I was constantly filling my head with stories of home birth and happy birth stories because that's the kind of birth that I was planning for.
mhm,
And so when that birth did not go that way, and I ended up having a very traumatic experience at the hospital, I had this podcast feed that was full of like home birth and positive birth stories. And um, I wanted to find stories like my own, not only to try and make sense of the experience that I had just had, because I was kind of reeling, like, how did this happen to me? But also, I wanted some hope. I wanted to hear of people that had had a birth like I had just had, and then found healing or found some sort of redemption, or even went on to have a positive birth. And I also found that in those early days postpartum, I felt a lot of guilt and I didn't have really a lot of empathy for myself. But when I heard other women's stories of having a home birth transfer and a cesarean, anything that was kind of similar to mine,
mhm,
I could find empathy for them. I wasn't
mhm,
judging them. I wasn't thinking, oh, you were so stupid. How did this happen to you? In the same way
mhm,
I was saying to myself. And so, in a way, hearing other women's stories really helped me find compassion and empathy for myself. And so, it was a really important part of my healing from that experience was just other women's stories. But, it was hard to find a collection of stories like that. Most birth podcasts, probably by design have a whole range of different types of stories that they share.
mhm,
And so I remember thinking in those early days, wow, I wish that there was just one podcast that was just about like healing birth trauma or healing from a bad birth experience. And that kind of just like stuck in my head and I thought about it for a while. And, I had a new baby, so I wasn't really in a place to start a podcast. But a few years later, after the birth of my second child, which was a life changing, oh, just a healing, incredible birth experience. I know that you know what that's like.
yeah.
I was
It
invited to
lights you up,
share. What's
lights you
that?
on fire. It lights
Oh, I
you up,
know,
it lights you
totally.
on fire.
It lights you on fire and it will change your whole entire life and you'll quit your corporate job and you'll become a podcaster, which is what I did. But yeah, I was invited to share my story on a pretty popular birth podcast, and I just discovered that I loved it. I loved the recording, I loved speaking about birth, like, something about it lit me up, and I just
Mm,
felt like, "I've gotta do this. I've gotta start a podcast and talk about the niche, like, the specific niche in the birth world that I'm really interested in and that I know a lot about because I went through it." And so,
yeah,
that was 5 years ago, and I can't believe it's
amazing.
been 5 years. It's been such an amazing blessing in my life, and I've
Mm.
met and talked to women all over the world, and, like you said, I've just learned so much, and I'm really proud of it, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Oh, it's amazing. I'm really just so impressed by everything that you've done and how to watch it unfold over the years too is just so beautiful. That's amazing. I
Well, thank
can't
you
I
for
don't
being
even
part of
have the
it
word.
too.
What's that?
Thank you for being part of it too.
Of course, of course, and I'm so glad that you have that space for women because like you said, there are all kinds of different spaces, but what you're focusing on is actually the healing from the trauma versus focusing on just the trauma piece, right? Like it's not a place to just go and like tell your deepest, darkest, worst moments and then be like, "Bye. I'm in a horrible place now." I love that
Well, that wouldn't
there
be
is
very fun to
what's
listen
that?
to. That wouldn't be very fun to listen to.
No, it wouldn't. It would be pretty depressing for sure. So I think that that's a fantastic thing that you have that for women that are working on their own healing because there are women that aren't there yet. And these
Right,
are the stories that they need in that time. I'll never forget when I had my C section with my daughter, and my sister said something later on like her heart broke for what she knew I was about to go through. And because she'd had 2 C-sections, it, like, actually makes me emotional thinking about this because of how far we've come, both of us, myself and her, who I've had now 2 VBACs, and she just successfully had a VBAC after 2 C-sections and no doctors believing in her, so Anyway, I remember her saying that to me and just thinking like, gosh, now I know what it's like, right? When I hear a mom who has had to transfer or whatever their story might be, that things just did not progress the way that they had in their mind, and how the next thing that they're going to go through after birth is that trauma. And it's heartbreaking. And I don't want anybody to go through it, which is why we want to be as educational as we can be to other women around us, to other moms that are about to walk through this path. So, with that said, I have a billion questions I want to ask you, because I can honestly only just even imagine what you must have learned over all of these years. And I want to soak up that knowledge as much as I can. I know our guests do too. So, our series being called, entitled God's Design for Birth, I would love to start there and learn more about what you have seen about God in the stories that you've heard from other women.
I love this question. This is such a beautiful question that I almost need to stop and think about a little bit. I'll say that I see God in every single story that I share on the podcast, even the stories where the birth is a challenging one.
Mm,
I don't know about you, but every single birth video I've ever seen, even if it's a challenging birth, like I said, the moment that there is a baby born, it just feels holy. Like it's
mm,
almost like I can just feel God's presence when a baby is born. And so generally, I mean, I always see God reflected in the birth stories that I share, but I've come to primarily now think of pregnancy and birth as a spiritual journey for us, for the
mm,
women that are bringing the babies onto the planet. And in that, I think that there are a few themes that God really invites us to explore during this time.
mm,
And it comes up a lot, especially women of faith will often say this to me, that they're connecting this to their relationship with God. And that's themes of surrender, themes of trust, themes of trusting in their own body and trusting in God's design of their body, which is
mhm.
actually kind of a radical thing to do nowadays. Like, I
It
know it
is.
sounds simple, but it's like
Yeah.
we live in a world where we like immediately inject something into a baby because like, that baby wasn't
Someone
born
told us to.
correctly. What's
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Because
Yeah,
someone told us to.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, really
Yeah.
fundamentally what's behind that is
Mhm,
we're not trusting God's design.
mhm,
And so it's radical to do that. And I think that that's
mm,
something that we're often invited to explore during our pregnancies. Healing is also something that I hear a lot, not just in the sense of healing from a difficult birth story, but there can be radical healing that happens in a woman's life that happens through the unfolding of a physiological birth. One woman just the other day told me
mm.
that her birth experience healed a lifetime of body image issues for her, which I thought was so beautiful. And I just feel like any time that radical healing like that happens, God is always involved.
Mm. That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would love to dig in to that side of it a little bit more, and, that story that you just mentioned of her saying that her body image issues were healed. Could you share a little bit more about that story and kind of
Yeah.
the context to it?
Yes, I can. I think that the context is relevant. So she was a very interesting person. She was very young. She was 21.
Mm,
And she had always, like so many of us, maybe all of us, dealt with like, wanting to be thinner, being on sort of the diet cycle, not really
mhm,
nourishing herself properly. And she seemed to be someone way ahead of her time, way ahead of her years. She decided that with her first pregnancy, she was going to free birth that baby. And in making that decision, she decided to take radical self responsibility for her health and the health of her baby, but really like for all aspects of her life.
mm,
And she didn't like talk about God very much, but she had like a big poster of I forget what it was, but it was like trust God, like a poster behind her head as we were recording. So I'm extrapolating that this was part of a spiritual journey for her. But it just really struck me
mhm,
that someone that young could take that much responsibility and make
mm,
that decision. And the birth was just a really, it was birth. It was everything that birth was. It was challenging. It was powerful. It was beautiful. She did it. And
aw,
she emerged from that experience feeling like, oh my gosh, there's absolutely nothing wrong with my body the way it is now. Even if I'm slightly heavier than before, I just did this. I mean, this was a miracle. She emerged feeling so strong. She had no medical authority there managing the process. It was just her and her partner. And I think her in-law, her mother, yeah, her mother-in-law was there too, which I thought that's an
Amazing.
interesting dynamic. But
Yeah.
it was healing for everyone. I guess like the mother-in-law also had a really strong medical background. She was a nurse and had a lot of fear and a lot of just like issues, a lot of fear around birth, like most people in the
Mhm.
medical field do. And
Mhm.
witnessing her daughter in law free birth her baby healed a lot of that within her as well.
Mhm.
And so, yeah,
Wow.
that was the major points of that story. I haven't released it
Wow.
yet. It's going to be in this next new season.
Oh, good. Good. Exciting. We'll have a nice, fresh episode to listen to. I love it. Looking forward to it. Well, there is a couple things that I want to pull out from that. First is the body side of things. That is a great conversation to have. I know that so many women, once they are in that fourth trimester, are then pressured by, especially we have social media, which drives me crazy with this whole bounce back culture and, oh, I got to get my old body back. And I'm sure that this is a theme and something that you've seen over the years. Do you find that the tides might be shifting at all with when it comes to that? Because I'm kind of starting to see it with some women who are like, no, I'm not playing this game of trying to get my body back. This is my body. And my body did an amazing thing. And I'm going to soak up skin to skin. And I don't care about any of the rest of that stuff. I kind of see there's a community of those women that seem to be getting larger, but I can't tell if it's just the communities that I'm in or if it's actually happening. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, I definitely think it's actually happening. I think it's part of a larger movement of women are starting to, how do I want to say this, take more agency in the realm of birth. I
Mm.
think that I mean, by the way, I'm sorry, I should have prefaced this by saying I have some really radical things to say or opinions about birth. Like, I don't know how radical you want me to be. I'll be as
As
honest as
radical as you want to be.
okay, cool.
As radical as you want. This is a radical show.
Okay, perfect. Because I'm gonna say some stuff that might sound kinda out there, but I
No.
getting back to your question, I think that we've actually been in a massive dark age as it relates to how birth is done, and I'm not
Mhm.
even talking about just in the United States, I mean everywhere, as far as I can tell across the globe.
Interesting.
We have been damaging women and damaging their babies during the management of their birth process, and it happened to our mother, our grandmothers, our great grandmothers, and then beyond there, I can't really say, but it's
Mm,
been a real dark age, and I think that we have been emerging from our birth experiences, many of us, perhaps most of us, damaged by it and hurt by it, and there's something that we there is a prize that we get when we have a normal physiological birth. There is a prize that we get, and that is the knowledge that we can do it.
mm,
There's like a somatically felt knowing of how strong and powerful you are when you go through that process and you're on the other side of it. And so while this my answer might not seem like it's directed to body image, I think it is because
mm,
I think I am seeing more and more women saying no to abusive systems that harm them during the birth process and birthing more at home, taking more agency for their own births. And when we do that, we always emerge on the other side stronger and with um, intact self-esteem. And I think that that has a direct impact on our body image.
mhm. I totally agree with you. I think I've seen something to I don't know if this is true. Maybe you can tell me or if you've seen this. Something about every 100 years, it's like there's a cycle and maybe it's more than 100 years, but it's something to the effect of women become unhappy with how they are being cared for during the birth experience. And so there are women that will then kind of go outside the system, midwives as we want to call them, or what we would know as maybe more of a birth keeper type
Mhm.
of person, because they're not certified or anything like that. But then what ends up happening is people need some sort of credentials and they go through this process of, okay, now they are tied to a system that they're getting checked. And then now midwives are medicalized and are part of the system. They're just an extension of the system. And really, you're being managed the same way at home as you would be in the hospital. And that, I don't know, whoever wrote this, I forget where it came from, but it basically talks about how then it becomes super medicalized and then the system breaks again and the whole routine starts over. Do you know what I'm talking about at
I
all?
do know what you're talking about, and I think that I can't remember who wrote it either, but
Probably a very poor
I think
explanation.
yeah, I think the concept is, solid, and I think that we're at that point now again, and maybe we have been at this point, at other times in history, but I do feel like we are at that point where we're going, "Wait a minute, this is not working. We gotta find a different solution."
We are,
Yeah,
because you're right. Our grandmother, my grandmother, had her children by twilight sleep.
mine too. Mine too.
So they don't even know, and we're not even getting into necessarily the impact of this on babies, which is something that a lot of mothers may not think about, but you'll think about it maybe years from now. That's kind of what happened to me, right? Is like you get this idea planted, and then over time you start to think about it more. But what does the baby experience and go through during birth? Because the baby is in the birth too. They're being born. We actually just talked about this with my sister's birth, where she thought about when he came out and he had a lot of bruising because his head was asynclitic. So it took him a bit to come, to come down. And she just had that thought like, man, what has this baby gone through in
Mhm.
birth? And now we factor in all these other stories of moms who have been coerced into C-sections or, had other experiences that didn't go right. If baby's feeling what mom is feeling, what are these babies experiencing through the way that we give birth? And I think that that's not something that we often think of. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, the babies are experiencing the trauma that the moms are experiencing.
Mhm.
And I think that, moms, I think, have an intuitive sense about this, but in the general culture, I don't think there's any awareness around what babies go through. I mean, it wasn't even that long ago that, what is it? It was accepted medical knowledge that babies didn't feel pain. How long ago
Oh,
was
yeah.
that? Like 50
And
years, like
you're
not that
right.
long ago.
And
What?
people will still try to argue that one. They'll say, "Oh, babies don't feel pain in the womb," and people will still try to argue against that. It's like, "Are you kidding me?"
I know. It's so
It's crazy.
crazy. So, yeah, I mean, there that I think that that needs to be part of the conversation too. I also feel like there's this women are not selfish for not wanting to have an intervened with traumatic birth. Like, we don't wanna have that happen, yes, for us, but also because the baby is part of it too, and the
Mhm.
baby does get left out of the conversation sometimes, but, when we're arguing and fighting for a natural birth, we're not just doing it for us, we're doing it for our babies as well.
All right, let me go back to the all of the mamas, okay, because you have heard from moms all across the world. What are some of the most common themes that you've heard across these stories? And what can we really learn from these moments, especially the moms that are entering into their birthing time? What advice might you give them?
Okay, this is where I get radical again to
Let's do
some
it.
ears. And I don't mean to be negative, but if I'm being honest, if I'm answering your question honestly, what I see across the globe, everywhere,
Mhm. Mhm.
is that we have a very broken maternity care system. It's just broken. It's not working well. It's not serving families. It's not serving mothers and babies. And mothers often have to fight very, very hard just to have a natural birth. And in some places, it doesn't happen at all. And so that's a bummer. But I think anyone going into motherhood needs to know that. It's just, you have to know it, because
Mhm.
if you don't know it, it's quite likely that you will learn the hard way.
Yeah.
And I do include midwives in this. Like you said, midwives that are licensed, they often can bring the hospital to your home. They
Mhm.
have many of the same restrictions, like not going past 42 weeks, stuff like that, that a doctor would impose upon you. They also have their own fears and biases too. Some midwives have seen things that scared them, and they can bring
Mhm.
that into the birth space. And so the whole point that I'm not trying to make anyone scared or scare any new pregnant mamas. I just wish that everyone knew that you have to be very, very careful about who you invite into your birth space, whether that be a doctor, a birth keeper, a midwife, a sister, a friend, even your partner in some cases. You have to really, really know. Um, you have to do this. You have to learn about what birth actually is, because many of
Mhm.
us don't really know much
Yep.
about birth.
Yep.
And you have to decide, what do you want? Like, what makes you happy? What gives you peace? What kind of a birth would make you happy? For some people, it's not what I would choose, and that's totally
Mhm.
fine. And then get very, very, very clear with whoever it is that you're inviting into your birth space exactly what you want and what you need to feel safe. And I think that if every new mom did that, I think that that would prevent tons of trauma. And I do have a podcast episode called 10 Questions You Must Ask Your Midwife. I think it was the first or second season.
Okay.
And I think that that podcast episode would be a great place to start, because there are deep questions. How do you feel about death? How do you feel about free birth? What's
Mm.
your I think it was actually, what's your relationship to death? I don't know. It's a great starting point, I think, for anyone who doesn't really know where to begin with finding the right practitioner for them.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's it. That's what I would want people to know.
That's
And that's the
great
biggest
advice.
theme that I just hear everywhere. Like,
Yeah.
I just hear it everywhere, that it's crazy that we have to fight so hard to have our babies come out of our bodies and not have someone do something to us. Like, it's everywhere.
Yeah. That's great advice, and I'm glad that you're pointing that out because I think that that's part of our stories too, right? Like,
Yeah,
we went to the
definitely.
hospital for our first birth. People were touching us. We didn't wanna be touched. My doctor kept sticking her hand in there, and I'm just like, "Get out of here with this."
Yeah.
And you don't realize how traumatic it is in the moment because you're in the moment and you're trying to just have a baby and all these things are happening to you. It's not
Mhm.
until later after that you're like, "Man, that made me feel horrible that that person kept sticking their hands inside of my body."
Mhm.
And those
Yeah.
little things, they blow up into big things when you're postpartum. And that is why we want to talk about this so that women can be aware of what they're getting themselves into when they go into the quote system, meaning go to a hospital to have a baby. And I always want to be clear, I'm not trying to push my own personal biases. Obviously, the listeners of this show know that I'm up here having my babies in the bathroom. So, no, it's not it's not like people don't know that, but a lot of folks are going to choose to still continue to go to a hospital and that's their choice. That's totally fine, but just be aware of what you're up against when you go into that setting because you can tell them things all you want and they will still do things even if you've said not to. That's what you're getting yourself into. And so having a doula might be a good idea if you're in that situation. Someone that you're going to tell, don't allow them to do any of these things that can kind of be your defense person. I hate to say this, but it's like you have to have someone there to fight for you so you can focus and just do what you need to do. And that's why I'm a fan of home birth because I don't want to fight with people during birth. I don't want to be stressed. I don't want to deal with anybody. I just want to be left alone and go up there to my closet and, just do my thing. Don't bother me. And I think that's another thing that a lot of first time moms maybe don't realize is that the more people you have around you, the harder it is for your body to do what it needs to do because it's distracted. You're your body's trying to squeeze that uterus, squeeze that baby down. And you're over here dealing with all this other stuff that doesn't allow you to stay in the moment and stay focused. I think that can be another problem that women run into when they're in that type of setting. I have said this before on the show and I'll say it again. You also don't need to agree to things in the hospital. And it's not necessarily my place to tell anybody what to do when it comes to that point but you can decline things. You can say no. You can ask to sign forms saying that I'm going to sign against medical advice. It's called an AMA. And I don't, I'll sign a form for you. You don't, you need me to sign something for you, I will sign it. But again, this is what you're up against in that setting. So the other alternative is to just not be a part of that. But it's going to take radical trust in the Lord to go to walk the home birth path But then once you do it, then you realize, wait a second, God created my body perfectly to do this without any intervention at all. I didn't need a doctor that's down over there to run over here to quote deliver my baby,
Mhm.
which I'm sure it drives you. I don't know if it drives you as crazy as it drives me. It's like, so I get people ask that, oh, who delivered your baby? I'm like, me, I did.
Yeah, you
And
did.
the baby wasn't delivered. They were born, he was
Yeah.
born or she was born. It's like so crazy, this world that we live in. But I think that that's good advice to give these moms is learn about birth, learn about the physiological side of it. Do you have any good resources for first time moms? Cuz that's the other part of it is, a lot of times we'll go to YouTube and we might learn a little bit, but maybe we don't learn fully about, the physiological side of birth.
I'm not just saying this because I'm a podcaster, but I truly believe you will learn so much. I think the most important information about birth you will learn from listening to women tell their birth stories. You don't need to know all of the details about the hormonal cocktail or all of the detailed physiology of the uterus. I mean, all that stuff is really interesting and cool, and maybe we should all know that. But I'm telling you, if you listen to women's birth stories, you will notice themes. Something will happen that in your labor you'll remember, oh, a woman said this about that and that happened. Like it is such an invaluable resource that there are birth podcasts out there, and you don't have to listen
Mhm.
to mine. Just listen to birth story podcasts, and you will learn more than any book that I could recommend, honestly.
That's a great point. I think you're right. It is in learning. That's how I learned from other women. Now,
Me
I
too.
did read a couple of books like Home Birth on Your Own Terms, which, it's like a big one in our home birth world. But I really, for that book specifically, I was interested in learning from her about herbs and just some kind of other little things, not necessarily all of it, right? Like, not necessarily, I didn't need to know everything about home birth, but there was a couple of things that I wanted to just read about and learn about. So that was helpful. But you're right. Like, Ina May Gaskin's Guide to Childbirth starts with birth stories. And she
Mhm.
starts with birth stories for a reason. It's because the stories of these women are what are going to help champion us forward. It's learning about birth from other moms who've done it. I mean, I I hate to be mean, but if we think about a lot of these OBs out there that are quote delivering babies,
They don't know
where do they have
anything.
where's their knowledge from?
They
A
they
book.
they know nothing. They know Many of them have never seen a physiological birth. Never seen it, never seen it in their training, don't see it in their practice, don't allow it to happen. Sorry, I'm being mean now. But yeah, I don't think that they actually know. I mean, I also don't really think that doctors know as much in generally about the human body as they think they know. So, I mean, that's also my bias showing, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, we know that it's true because there's so much fear. If
yeah.
they truly understood how birth works, they wouldn't be so afraid. They wouldn't feel that they needed to manage it. But birth in the industrialized medical complex it's a financial system. It's goods and services that and it's crazy to think about it like that, but it is. We are just a product that's coming in. They have certain protocols to getting out the product that they need to get out and then move on. You're just another bucket, another number in the queue.
Mhm.
And I don't know about you, I don't like to be numbers in a queue. Doesn't make me feel good.
No,
And even
especially not
even
when
more,
I'm
I mean,
birthing a
if you
baby.
right? And then if you think about the model and how broken it is, right? Like, you go for appointments, but the people that are going to be there on the day that you give birth are going to be all different people. You're birthing with strangers. And one of the things that you noted earlier was, people being present in your birth and who being cautious or being thinking through who's going to be in your birth space because that really is a sacred place. And there's a lot of talk in our worlds, birth worlds is what I mean, about the intimacy in making a baby is the same intimacy that the baby comes into the world under. And we're going to have that intimate moment under fluorescent lights and strangers and beeping around us, right? And that's one of the beauties of embracing the physiological part of this is you're able to really unlock the true way of birth, the just the I don't even know what I'm talking about. Just that I don't even know how to describe it. It's so primal
Mhm.
and so normal and so natural. And it doesn't have to be this big show, this big spectacle that it is. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, that you know, leave your house, you get in the car and you go do things at the hospital. It's simpler than that. It doesn't have to be that complicated. Our
Mhm.
body, I mean, think about it. There are women that have been in a coma and their babies are born. Why is that?
That's
Because
because
the
birth
body
works.
knows what to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, and also, I totally agree with everything you said, but just to add on to a lot of the things that are pathologized as wrong or a problem or bad within the medical system, they're actually not. There actually is an intelligence behind some of the things that we've just decided are incorrect or wrong, like breech babies, you know?
Yeah, totally. One of those I heard recently from someone who just had her baby and was in the traditional system and just was sharing how things went and said, "Yeah, it was an almost an emergency. The cord was wrapped around the baby's neck, and so they almost did a C-section. But then the baby came out. It's so hard for me to keep my mouth shut at this point in my life with all of the stuff that I've heard,
Yeah, me too.
especially because I don't want her to sit and ruminate over my baby almost died. That
Mhm.
is horrible, right? So I'm like, "Hey, I just want to share with you that the doctors, were they don't understand that completely." And I kind of like went into this little tangent. And then afterwards I was like, "Why did I say anything?" Like I should have just kept my mouth shut because it's hard to tell people that are not yet awake necessarily to what's going on in the system. It's hard to tell them something that's going against what a doctor told them because they have credentials and they're a doctor and they said that it was almost an emergency. So that's sometimes what I feel like we're combating, which can be challenging, but at the same time, it's not my job to convince someone of anything. Like that's the Lord's work, and he will help guide other women and families to the right answers. That's his job. And I guess I feel, what we can do is we can share in the right context. In that context, I kind of regretted sharing just because I felt like her response made me feel like she wasn't prepared to hear something like that. Now, you're such a great listener. I mean, you're trained and you're so good at listening. So it must be challenging sometimes. I don't know. Is it hard sometimes to hear things and then, like you probably have feedback too that you want to be like, "Actually, I let me help you with this." And, you give your answers. How do you manage that when you run into it?
It's super challenging for me every time, and almost every single birth story I hear, there's something where I can pick up like a mistruth that this person believed about her experience, or a place where a provider intervened and caused the very problem that caused the problem.
Mhm.
And I never offer my opinion. I never insert myself into any story that a woman is sharing with me because I have learned the hard way that it's just entirely not my place. And um, these when you ask people to like think critically about the interventions that happen around birth and our medical system, the way it's set up, what you're really inviting them into is something so much bigger and deeper. You're inviting them into kind of shattering the worldview that we all live in. You know, it's a real head exploder if you had to like accept that like maybe your doctor didn't do the right thing or doesn't know everything. And so like realizing that like people are not everyone is ready for that. I don't ever
Mhm.
offer my opinions about anything. I
Mhm.
always offer empathy and understanding and gratitude that a woman is sharing her birth story with me, because it is also just a sacred thing to be brought into. And
Mhm.
I often feel like the most disrespectful thing that I could do would be to say, "Oh, well, that isn't what actually happened. That happened," you know? But I mean, just today I interviewed someone and she had to transfer out of her home birth because of something the midwives picked up on in
Mhm.
their listening to the heartbeat and telling her story. And I knew exactly what had caused the complication that caused her to transfer in her story. I heard it immediately. I could tell exactly what it was. The details don't really matter. And
Mhm.
she ended up having this extremely traumatic experience that she has been in therapy for 2 years. And
Wow.
it was like just one thing I heard in her story, and I was like, "That is what caused this to happen." But I'm never gonna say that to her because also her story is so much more than that. So, it's challenging though. I mean, I feel for you and I completely understand your struggle. It's really hard not to tell people, especially something about the narrative of the cord around the neck. It's, like, really triggering for people because it sounds scary, but when you don't understand the actual physiology of the cord and the Wharton's jelly that's on the cord and how protective it actually is to be wrapped around the baby's body because then that prevents a prolapse from happening, like, it just sounds triggering, but it seems to be one of those common maybe it's a common reason that doctors say you needed a C-section and we just accept it because it sounds scary, but it's a complete falsehood, like,
Yeah.
completely. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you addressed that there at the end because it is part of God's design for babies and for birth is that that cord is nice and long and baby can wrap around in it. They roll around in there. It's only natural if God he is the designer of this, right? I don't think that he would, design something so poorly that one third of these babies, oh, those third are at a risk for death because of this. I don't think so.
I don't think so.
It's by design, like you said. And do you want to tell us a little bit? Because it sounds like you have a really good, you shared a little piece of it. So tell us more about the cord and its design. What have you learned?
Sure. Well, I should have maybe said, like, 40 minutes ago that I'm not a medical professional and I have no
That's okay.
medical training at all. Anyone listening, this is just stuff that I've picked up. So, okay, so there's a coating on the cord called Wharton's jelly. It makes it really slippery, really slimy and sticky and really elastic. And so what I was referring to was when the baby has the cord wrapped around their neck or just around their body like a seatbelt, you'll sometimes hear about that. That is actually very useful because when the baby is coming out of your body, it prevents the cord from going first, which actually would be a true emergency if the
Hmm.
cord was prolapsed and was coming out before the baby. And I again, coming back to this common theme that we've touched on so many times, I mean, often the prolapse can be caused by interventions of other people. I don't know that I've ever heard of one happening in a undisturbed birth, but
Mm.
that's an aside. So the way that it's designed to be tightly with your baby as your baby comes out because it prevents what could actually be a true emergency.
Hmm. Perfect. Beautiful. That was a great explanation. Thank you. All right. So we have talked a little bit about some of these common themes, and this is kind of on that same note, but slightly different question. Is there or are there any perceptions that you've noticed that women have about either birth itself or an aspect of birth that is just blatantly wrong? All
That
of
you
it.
No, well, I was gonna say that it's so the misperceptions around birth that I've encountered or that I wanna dispel, that it's dangerous, that you can't do it, that there's something uniquely broken about your body because your OB told you something, 10 years ago about your pelvis. Um, Even that it's a medical event. I don't even see birth as a medical event anymore with the knowledge that I have. I see it as a physiological event that will unfold most likely, ideally, without any interruptions or strangers being there. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, all of it, like, all of it is a huge misconception,
All of it.
and we have to unlearn it, and, also birth is not it's not the way that it's depicted in television and movies, on your back screaming, like, that's not I get that's how it unfolds sometimes in the, modern world, but that's not what it actually is. It's a physiological process. It's the culmination of a spiritual journey. it's an initiation into a new version of yourself. Even if you've had 5 babies, every single time you do it, you're going to be changed.
Mhm.
And that's what I think birth actually is. And all of that other stuff is just like capitalism and noise and like the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely is. It's so funny, something that you just mentioned just sparked a thought for me on the side of the physiological. You might remember from my story that I used hypnobabies to retrain and reframe my thoughts because of how our culture shows us birth, or how birth shows up for us in our lives on TV and movies. Like you said, that we are taught and we're trained it's this emergency. You know how it is in the movies, like, oh, my water broke and now I go to the hospital and then I'm screaming and people are holding the legs back and oh, the babies, it's like this big huge drama. And one of the things that I loved about that Hypno Babies program was that it trained me to reframe my own thoughts on how I thought about birth. And that's something
Yes.
that I think that we go into birth not doing enough of, is saying,
Yes.
what are my perceptions? What do I actually think that birth is? Because I thought I knew what birth was before I went into it. Then I went into my first experience, and as soon as I was experiencing contractions, that's when it all went south for me, because I hadn't learned yet that contractions are a necessary, needed, and beautiful part of a baby being born. And once I understood that it was normal and natural to feel that, and that if I just honed in on that instead of trying to fight it, you used the word surrender earlier.
Mhm.
Once we surrender to that fear of pain, I think that that's where the beauty really can unfold for us, and where things can shift, and where we can experience a change and not have that hospital drama TV birth that they depict for us.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned a mindset shift because television really is programming, and all of us, whether we're aware of it or not, we've been programmed by someone else's ideas of the world.
Yeah.
And you're so spot on. I mean, going into my first birth, I did not do enough deprogramming at all. Even though I thought of myself as someone who trusted the process and wanted to birth at home, um, I didn't do the really deep inner work of really examining my beliefs about birth and reprogramming them. I love that the tool that you use. I mean, I think there's so many different ways to do it, but
Oh, absolutely. Lots of
it's
ways to do it.
key.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely key.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm definitely not necessarily promoting one over another. It just was what helped me at that time. It was what kind of came up. And I think that you're right, though. And as a woman gets closer to her birth, I think that's when it gets even more important to just really focus on positive birth stories and, positive situations, and not get sucked into all that stuff. I remember, I think it was my sister, when I was getting close with Ben, saying, "Oh, you got to watch this show, the one with the midwives, called The Midwives."
Right?
And I
Yeah.
was like, "I am not watching a show about childbirth right now. You're crazy."
No.
And it was funny because I started watching it after he was like, "Okay, let me see what this is about." It was so traumatic. I was like, "Why did you tell me to watch this?" You know? And it was funny because she was still in the hospital birth mindset. She hadn't yet gone through her own experience, and now she gets it. And I
Mhm.
think that sometimes we have to just experience things to understand them. And I know that we want to save all these moms from all the pain that we went through, but there are going to be some that hear, and, it takes kind of going through it on their own to really set them on fire for birth too. And I think that's the beautiful thing about this community that we're in, is it's a bunch of women who are really on fire for birth because we know how awesome it can be.
Yes. So
Right?
well said. Absolutely.
Well,
Yes.
good. Well, anything else you want to leave us with on this episode about learning moments?
I wanna say to any pregnant mom out there that's listening to this, I hope I didn't freak you out. Um, Listen to birth podcasts, listen to people's stories, you'll learn so much. You're capable of so much more than you realize. Don't let anyone's fear get into your sphere, just have strong boundaries and, be very, very, very decisive about who you invite into your birth, and always listen to your intuition. Sometimes our intuition is way more spot on than our brain, and
Mhm.
use your intuition when you're making any choice around your care provider, and you've 100% got this.
Awesome. That's great advice. And God gave us our intuition. So definitely tune into that because He gave it to us for a reason.
Mhm.
And thank you so much, Diana, for being here today. This has been fantastic. I'm looking forward to talking with you more as well. And I know everyone is in for a treat next week as well. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Awesome. And thank you for tuning in and for being on this journey with us. If you would like to follow Diana, you can follow her on Instagram at Healing Birth. You can also find her on her website, healingbirth.net. And of course, you can find her podcast streaming everywhere. It's called Healing Birth. Definitely check her out. Listen to those birth stories and let us know what you think. I love the stories that you share, and I'm so excited for this audience to hear more from you there too. And if you'd like to follow along outside the podcast, you can join the mission on Instagram at the Radiant Mission on Instagram or on Facebook at the Radiant Mission Podcast. And of course, you can always watch this podcast in video format if you're not doing it right now on YouTube at the Radiant Mission or just look for Rebecca Toomey. Today, we are going to close with a Bible verse that Diana actually really loves and finds her center in when it comes to birth. So I'm going to read from Matthew 6, verses 5 through 14. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you even ask Him. This, then, is how you should pray. Our Father, in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive you. And we are wishing you a radiant week, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.